Well, I'm here to answer a few of the questions, and because there were some recurring questions and questions that have been sent in, I want to tackle 3 of those that I've been asked to address, and then we'll get to whatever else is on your mind. One question, which is asked in various ways, is what about life support issues, end-of-life issues, and I just want to quickly address that very complicated and broad question. There is an increasing movement in our day, of course, for something that the world calls euthanasia. Euthanasia is simply a compound of the Greek word ou, like we have euangelion, the gospel, or a eulogy, and the word thanos, death. Good death, right? So what we're saying is that this is a good thing that someone die. Right? This is often called the right to die movement, mercy killings. Euthanasia, in essence, let me define it biblically here, is simply murder to avoid pain or disgrace. I say that because it is done intentionally, either passively or actively, and what we are saying, or let me also add assisted or unassisted. And we see a lot of this in the news, and we want to deal with the reality of it in our day, which is a little more complicated in the ancient world, although it is not absent. 1 Samuel, for instance, chapter 31 on Mount Gilboa, the battle pressed hard against Saul. The archers found him. He was badly wounded by the archers. Seems like he's got a terminal problem here. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. I might be tortured, and I will be disgraced." But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and he fell upon it. He asked for assisted death here, but instead, since his armor bearer wouldn't do it, he died himself. We see that also in Judges chapter 9 when Abimelech came to the tower and he fought against it. He drew near the door of the tower to burn it with fire, and a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and he said, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say a woman killed me." And his young man thrust him through and he died. Here he asked for assisted suicide, and he was helped by his armor bearer in this case. So euthanasia is the killing, right, intentionally, of either yourself or by someone else or some other means. I called it murder because murder, the intentional killing of life, if it's not in a just context of a judicial sentence or in warfare that is justly declared, we just need to remember that murder is prohibited, obviously in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and elsewhere, and murders, of course, throughout the law are culpable and they're held responsible for murder. We could look at this same list under the heading of abortion, for instance, assuming that we are agreed upon that we have human life in the womb, the preborn. So what I'm recommending is, obviously, and I'm trying to get broad down to the specifics, other solutions should be employed. As Christians and as a Christian pastor, that's what I'm asking all of us to consider in the light of death, and death that is seemingly imminent. In both those situations with Abimelech and Saul, they were both wounded, mortally wounded, we assume, and as they're dying, they wanted to speed the process up. Well, the solution in Scripture is a little different to avoid murder. What we're looking for here in Scripture is great courage. Philippians chapter 1, for instance, in verse 20, Paul says, "It's my eager expectation and hope that we will not at all be ashamed." Certainly we don't want that. And he says, "But that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death." It's good to inject the word courage there because that's what the Bible, as a virtue, would always suggest that you aim for. And when you or your loved one is in a situation where they're suffering, like in the situation of a crushed skull or being badly wounded as Saul on Mount Gilboa, what we're going to say is the Christian response is, number one, Saul, have courage, right? Even if there is potential threat of, in his case, mistreatment, or even just the shame of being killed, Abimelech, in a pretty unconventional way by a woman throwing a millstone down on his head. What we want is great courage, and we should always push for this when we're thinking of ourselves and thinking about our own death and thinking what we need is courage. We also need what the Bible calls his grace in the midst of suffering that may seem unbearable. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we've quoted a lot in our series that we're currently in 2 Corinthians 1. But we think about Paul pleading 3 times about this thorn in the flesh, that it should leave him. But God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. What we should be asking for is God's provision, his unmerited provision of grace. And that doesn't mean that our circumstance is going to change necessarily, as I preached on this morning and last night, but it does mean that we're asking God and believing God to give us the grace and the courage and his favor to get us through the challenge of death. And then thankfully, God is in favor of physicians, even though, as we saw this morning, King Asa, after 39 years, couldn't learn to trust in God and separate the means from the source. We know that God has said in Scripture that there's time to medicinally try to help, and there's a place for palliative care for the dying. Proverbs 31, verses 6 and 7, after saying drinking alcohol can be a foolish endeavor, and usually is, it says, give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. And that's kind of a brushing off of his hands regarding some of those who are in misery, but that's connected, at least in the connection of having people that are dying. And as they're perishing, we ought to make them as comfortable as possible. So just in a general sense, the virtues of Scripture are you should seek to be and promote great courage in the face of suffering and death, and God's grace to provide all that's needed for the process of dying for you or your loved ones. And we should all be in favor of medication to try and mitigate the pain that is associated with the suffering near death. The distinction of life support decisions. We need to think through some of what we're talking about when we're dealing with, okay, when are we going to pull the plug, as they say, or when am I going to direct in my advance directions regarding my own death? Number one, I think we begin with the concept of life being artificially maintained. And in our day, very different than you might have on the battlefield in the ancient world, we have certainly the technology to do a much better job at maintaining life when life is artificially maintained. And that's one thing that we need to be thinking about when we think about life support. There's another thing we always need to consider is if we're talking about pulling a plug, for instance, and stopping the artificial maintenance of life, whether that's respiration or whatever it might be, we need to think about the professional as best we can, using natural revelation and the wisdom of medicine and the medical profession, trusting in honest medical professionals. Is this illness that we're dealing with, is it terminal? Even if there was a medic, let's just say, on the battlefield there, and Abimelech's got his doctor coming up. I mean, is this something that could be nursed back to health or not? Well, we're still going to call for courage and grace and medicine, but the question is this a informed opinion that this particular illness and its compounding problem on a deathbed, for instance, is this genuinely terminal? And then, is it imminent, which of course is a subjective, at least it's open to subjective interpretation. Of course, I could say my death problem is imminent in the sense that I'm in the process of dying. But as an informed professional opinion, what kind of imminence are we talking about here? And we have to figure out these questions. These all need to be considered. And of course, we're going to talk about extraordinary measures. These are choices, for instance, like the do not resuscitate orders that you may have in a will, or some kind of order that you might have signed before a particular surgery or procedure that you're having. But we want to ask, what kind of extraordinary measures are we looking at? If I collapsed on the stage and being relatively healthy, I would hope that you'd want to practice CPR on me to see if you could perhaps revive me. Someone with the laughter now, I'm not sure, but I was hoping maybe someone would want to do some chest compressions and maybe do some artificial breathing for me. The extraordinary measures, though, if I am with a terminal illness that has been, at least in an informed opinion, that death is near, and my life is being artificially maintained in some way, well then this choice becomes much more objective, right? Would this make sense now? There's a couple things we need to always keep in mind, and that is biblical revelation. Biblical revelation is God revealing and giving us information that should govern our decisions. And when it comes to death, we should understand that God is certainly telling us to value life. And before we start withdrawing extraordinary measures with someone on their deathbed, we want to say, well, of course, God is pro-life. If I collapse, you don't say, well, he's preached a lot of sermons, just to let him go. You should say, well, we should be pro-life. We should want Pastor Mike to continue to live. And so biblical revelation is all about the importance of the sacred nature of life in the image of God, and we want to choose whenever we can in favor of life. So that is part of one direction pushing us to always be trying to advance life and secure life and trying to maintain life. On the other hand, there's natural revelation, which often comports with biblical revelation, but biblical revelation in this case gives us the value and the priority, but natural revelation speaks to us, and it does comport with Genesis 3 and the reminder that God, and if you don't believe the scripture, you believe just the population stats, that everyone ends up dying. So we recognize there's certain things in natural revelation about death's imminence, death's insistence, the process of death, the force of death, and all of this needs to be weighed when you're dealing with the quote-unquote pulling the plug. So if you are going to consider these things, as I have and my wife has when we are writing out our living trust, for instance, we want to put in there something that's going to describe what we believe we want done, what we are choosing to have done, as something we can do in our right mind now in relative good health when we are in a situation, whether it's a car accident or the end of our life. Say, here's what we're looking to do. And in our case, we don't want extraordinary measures to continue for any amount of time. We have a certain amount of time, and I wish I could remember what it is, but a certain amount of time where we say, we even put in our living trust, we want our church to pray, and I forget what the time is. Hopefully you'll get the email, and be within the window. So check your email daily, because it may be 24 hours, could be 48 hours, I don't know what it is, but a number of hours where we say, let's do what we can with extraordinary measures, and if the informed opinion is that death is imminent, and the problem is terminal, then we will withdraw extraordinary measures to allow death and the force of death to take over, because that is going to win in the long run eventually. I should say, barring the kind of medical technology that might be able to sustain the respiration and pulmonary circulation and all the rest, brain activity notwithstanding. So there may be questions that arise in your mind in addressing that question. I tried to do it a little more systematically than I would if you just raised your hand, because I had this ahead of time. So there is at least a framework for us to talk through later if we need to. Second question I was asked to address is, should I tell my kids what they will inherit? And I think this really is a question of full disclosure, right? Lying is not that I got to tell you everything. Lying, is reserved to me misdirecting you. And so full disclosure, that's a different situation. You can be an honest, integrous, truthful person, but not tell your kids everything, both when they are 3 and when they're 13, and maybe when they're 33 or 43, and you're thinking about your will. A couple of things biblically maybe to consider, both the pros and cons. You need to understand this could risk conflict unless you are saying, with reasonable children, that this is not just a 50-50 or 33 and a half and 33 and a third, I guess, for your 3 kids, or 25% for your 4 kids. If you are weighting your inheritance in a particular direction, or revealing that, is certainly risking conflict. And oftentimes we do weight this in a particular direction, or choose to give half of our estate to a ministry, or whatever it might be. And what I think I need to remind you of is that depending on who you're telling this to, James chapter 3 reminds us, especially if it's between children or between a child and ministry, or if you've got a blended family, there's a lot of jealousy and selfish ambition in people's hearts. And sadly, it says that wisdom doesn't come down from God. It comes down, or it comes to us from Satan, right? It's earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic. Where there's jealousy and selfish ambition, there will be disorder in every vile practice. So you need to weigh the decision in part by who am I telling this to and what will this do? Now, if there's a cantankerous, divisive person to start with, then maybe this news isn't going to fuel anything because it's, you can't fuel something that's burning and raging out of control anyway. But just know you need to consider the risk of conflict in your family. It's going to end up getting there eventually, but the question is, do you want this to linger in the present? Also, any discussion about your future inheritance and what you're going to pass down to your family certainly is, you got to think about the risk of greed. And the Bible says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So we need to know the desire of human hearts, certainly in their fleshly impulse, is to want to get rich. And especially in our day where, there's so many people that don't work hard and don't save and they spend more than they make. And they look at your generation perhaps and say, well, you've paid off your bills, you've lived within your means, you have a lot of money. And you start to say, well, you're going to get, X number of dollars here when I croak. And you think, that's probably not the right word to use in this series, when I die. It's really not a euphemism, it's a misspeak at the end of a long weekend. Let me just say this. You certainly can fuel a kind of greed that may be something you don't want to dangle out in front of them. Let them grapple with this with no time to consider it for 10, 12 years or 15 years or however long you're going to have between the arrival of this disposition of your inheritance and the telling. So just, you got to consider who you're telling. And they may not, if you die without being fully dependent on your adult children, they may have no idea of your financial situation, as happens often. And to say, hey, here's millions of dollars that you're going to inherit, I don't know, there can be a lot of stimulation of greed that is not helpful for people as they lean over, hopefully not praying for your demise, but who knows? And then I think it kind of comports with letter B, but the risk of financial irresponsibility. And one thing I don't want to do, and even as an adult, thinking about my own parents and in-laws, what I don't want to do is to think about some windfall down the way because of parents or in-laws that have done well with their finances and lived within their means, and think, well, sure, I can pull out a lot of loans at this point, or I can, borrow against the equity in my house, or whatever it might be, because I know, as soon as mom and dad are gone, I'm going to have this big windfall. So I just have to quote Proverbs 22, and I didn't listen to what Rick Talcott gave you, but I'm sure this was quoted at some point. But the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is a slave of the lender. I want to teach my kids, and I have from the time they were tiny, as soon as they can understand my verbiage, you should not go into debt. There's only a couple things that I think even make sense for you to go in debt over. So, the credit cards and living on credit, just don't. And so I don't want, if my kids are irresponsible, to try and give them some sense that, one day you can pay off all your loans because you're going to get this windfall when I'm gone. So you've got to think through those things, the risk of conflict, the risk of greed, the risk of financial irresponsibility. On the other hand, you may be persuaded by the fact that you have an opportunity to promote your values. If you're saying to someone who's a potential, prodigal son of Luke 15, who's going to go out and waste all this, you say, well, I'm not going to fund his flagrant sinful lifestyle, so I'm going to tell him right now, you're getting 5% of my income, and your Christian brother is getting 95% or whatever, 50%. The other part's going to Focal Point or Compass Bible Church or CBI or Compass Press, or I could go on. Here's my point. There is something about the direction of this. And I thought through this and prayed about the concepts that were asked. And I thought of Proverbs 16:26. I quote this more than most people because I hear hardly anybody quote this passage. But a worker's appetite works for him and his mouth urges him on. Now, in our day, with the social safety net the way it is, a lot of people don't have this problem, but the hunger of the laborer, it says, get up and go to work. And it may be that you know that even the sense in which, hey, you are not responsible, I'm not going to fuel your irresponsible lifestyle, may be the kind of at least forecasted potential lack that they say, that's ridiculous. Well, you mean to tell me if I were a little bit more responsible that you would treat me like my sibling? And your answer would be yes. And it could be that the appetite even for them to be a part of your inheritance could urge them on. So promoting your values and your priorities, and your spiritual priorities might be something arguing in favor. The other thing is it's an opportunity to affirm stewardship. And this would have to happen in the right context when you are thinking about whatever you've done, to say, I'm going to let you know what I'm doing because of just the ability that I have to bless you. A lot of parents die with a lot of debt. They don't die with an inheritance. And I think the Bible clearly says in Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance not only to his children, but to his children's children. And the point is that if you live responsibly, this isn't to brag, this isn't to boast, but it's at least to affirm stewardship. It'd be good for your kids, your adult kids, to think, wouldn't you want to live the way that I've lived, to live within my means so that I can give you and your children something that will be an inheritance to you? And that may be even, much like Proverbs 16:26, a motivation. And just affirm stewardship is a good thing. If you've been a good steward, you've got something at the end of your life to pass on. And the Bible says that's what the good man does. And you don't have to leave it just to your children, but clearly it is an opportunity. And if it were a godly family and all your kids are saved, this would be a good thing just to even say, I want to tell you about your inheritance, and barring me being in need of medical assistance and having to spend all of my inheritance on myself in the end of my life, I just want you to know, I want you to have this. I want you to be a good steward of what I've been a good steward of. So it could be an opportunity to affirm stewardship. Lastly, it could just manage expectations. Some of you need to tell your kids about their inheritance because they don't have much coming from you. And that might not be a bad idea, to have full disclosure about what's coming. Every prudent man acts with knowledge, but a fool flaunts his folly. I think the prudence of your children, your adult children, thinking about all that's going to go into dealing with your demise, it'd be good for them to know kind of what they're dealing with. And all you have to do is a little bit of math here. To figure out it's going to cost a lot to deal with wrapping up your estate and your burial and all the rest if you haven't done all the pre-planning that we're asking you to do in this series. But the point is, it's something that certainly is a part of the planning of your kids, not so that they can go into debt. And again, all of these things, D, E, and F, are all in favor of full disclosure if you've got the right circumstance. So I don't have a ironclad answer for this other than to say, you need to determine who you're telling this to. And as long as your motives are good, right, it could be a yes and it could be a no from my perspective in watching this go down in people's lives and ministry. Third question I was asked was about organ donation. First of all, I think a lot of people bring this up snidely because they're thinking about the fact that you believe that you should bury respectfully and, oh, wait, what about organ donation? See, they're trying to make a point that they really can't believe my theology in trying to respectfully lay lives aside for the resurrection because, what about this thing? This is a good thing. And you're saying it's a good thing, but you can't have both good things. This is how it's often brought up. Well, I'm not going to say that you giving your corneas to someone or you giving, some healthy organ, your heart or whatever, is an issue with the glorification process. The Bible speaks of the glorification process as a complete glorification. Philippians 3:20 and 21 says our citizenship's in heaven. We're waiting for our Savior to return, who will transform our lowly body, right, with all of its imperfections, to be like his glorious body. And we could look into all the details of 1 Corinthians 15. To be like his glorious body by the power that enables him to even subject all things to himself, including whatever's missing from your organs and your torso. So glorification is not contingent on whether or not you've got all your pieces in place. Letter B, missing body parts doesn't seem to be a concern. Matter of fact, Jesus says, and I know there's some hyperbole in these passages, both in Mark and Matthew, but he says, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to cross this finish line, to enter life with one eye than with two eyes, just to be an indulger in sin, and that's proving your lack of faith and regeneration, to be thrown into hell. Better for you to limp along in this life, whether it's your hand, your foot, or your eye, because at the end, right, everything is going to be, it seems like it's no big deal. I know it's hyperbole, but the idea of this, at least, I don't think would even make any sense if in some way, well, I got to think about limping my way through eternity. It's not a concern in this analogy. Neither of these might be persuasive, so let me add this. Passages that are specific about all earthly defects being made whole. Here's a passage, and of course, the immediate near field fulfillment is the millennial kingdom, but certainly it's true, the millennial kingdom. The resurrection takes place prior to that for all those who are prior to that in time. Of course, there will be people that get right with the Messiah after this. But look at this prophecy in Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35, be strong and fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance and recompense, and he will come and save you. It's a lot of the, one hand and the other discussion about the coming of Christ to establish his kingdom. Going to come to destroy the enemies and bring judgment to them, but he's going to save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be open, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the lame man will leap like the deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Well, what's going on with that? Well, I go back to Philippians 3, verse 20, that the power of God to regenerate a body in the glorification process that we read about in Romans chapter 8 this weekend from this platform, all of that glorification is going to be complete. And any missing body parts or any missing nerves or anything that doesn't work right in a body is all going to be made whole. And if you have someone who's never walked, who was born a paraplegic, is going to be leaping for joy. Whether that was damaged in this life by accident or whether you gave one of your kidneys to your friend so that he could make it through his kidney problem, and you will have two kidneys in the resurrected body, is what I'm saying. So organ donation does not relate to that. So don't say, you can't talk about burial, I'm going to incinerate, because, can't have two good things like organ donation. Well, before we rush into organ donation, let me just say this. You need to be informed of OPO practices, organ procurement organizations. There's 52, 57 of them in the United States right now who do this, the garnering of organs and finding the right recipients for it. And the Bible would be really clear, just because someone says, well, this would be a good idea to put a red dot on your license so that you're a donor. The simple believes everything, right? But the prudent gives thought to his steps, including someone taking your organs and putting them in someone who needs them, right? One who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. Why? Because they believe whatever. So everything that you're going to do that is as important as what are you going to do with this body that was the temple of the Spirit. And before I start giving my body away to be harvested for other people, I at least need to be informed about the practices of the organ procurement organizations. These are all 501c3s. They're nonprofits across the country. They, of course, work with all the medical institutions, but there's a lot that has gone on in this process. And there's a lot of things that we must learn. You should be informed about all the scandals that relate to organ procurement. There's plenty of discrepancies. There's a lot of organ waste. There's been unreported deaths just for the sake of this issue, lack of transparency. And this has happened too in, mortuary businesses, but a whole lot less, at least percentage-wise, than the OPOs in our world. You can look up the scandal, the FBI raid in 2014 in Arizona. Maybe you saw that in the headlines. Or the California body broker scandal in 2020. This is just a few years ago. New Jersey organ trafficking case in 2009. There are black markets for organs. There's exploitation of vulnerable populations. There's mismanagement and ethical violations of organ procurements, failure to meet standards. There's even unquestionable death determinations in the quest to try and get these organs in cases. There's body brokering scandals you can read about, inequities in access to transplants. There's fraud and corruption that has been reported. There's been kickbacks. There's been falsification of reports. So even in Orange County, they ran a big article about what was going on probably 15 or 20 years ago with UC Irvine. And of course, that was specific to one particular person, I think, and maybe it included a network of doctors. But I'm not saying it is wrong. If you want to be a donor, you can be a donor. But I just need you to be wise, because the simple believes everything, and they feel pretty good about putting, the donor dot on their license. But I don't know if they still do that, but that's how they used to do it. But they don't think through, at least the industry, because it is a little bit like the mortuary scandals that have been out there. That's why we want to use mortuaries that we trust. Because no one likes to no one likes to think about it. As we started this 3-4 weeks ago when I was up here, we like to sweep death and all of its, ancillary issues under the carpet. No one likes to think about it in this kind of urbanized, modern, gentrified culture that we're in. But in reality, right, there's a lot that goes on there because no one likes to look closely at it. And the organ procurement organizations in the United States, though there's increased regulation and they're trying to oversee it a little more closely, there's a lot that goes on with organ procurement organizations in the United States. And then I would add just one more point here on this. You should consider options that are available for cadaver research. Some people say, well, I give my body to medical research. I'm going to have it be a part of the medical school at USC or whatever. And you may say, well, that's a good thing. Well, again, getting back to the concept of the resurrection, I don't think I would have handed over Christ's body or any apostle's body or my wife's body just for anyone to do research on. I think it's very different to give my body away or my loved one's body away to complete medical research, particularly when there are plenty of options, sadly, in our culture for that kind of research. And you may disagree with me on this, but I think you need to be informed and you need to be careful about that. And it's like a lot of things. It's like the fires in Southern California. I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but when there's a hurricane or a flood, I'm not opposed to the church getting involved in these things. But like Paul in 1 Timothy, we need to be careful, particularly when the whole world is jumping on the bandwagon and every group out there that hates God is willing to give to help people. As the heartstrings are rightly tugged on, watching people that are displaced or whatever it might be. When the world is gushing money, or in this case, whatever it might be, a heart or corneas to people that need them, I think Christians often cannot be at the front of that kind of trend. And that gives you a little bit of my opinion on it, although I'm not opposed to it. Especially if you're going to give an organ as you're alive to someone, that's certainly a great act of sacrifice. And I think that is completely appropriate because they're not going to let you die on the table when you're giving a kidney to a loved one. All right, that might raise a number of questions, and so it is time for your questions. I won't have any slides for your questions because I have no idea what your questions are, but I had those questions, so I spent a little time working on those questions. All right.
All right, we'll take the first one over here.
I hate to say it because it worries me more than my own death. As a parent, how should we go about planning our kids' death?
Planning for your kids' death? Well,
if it happens.
Yeah, well, it's not bad to think that through because it's certainly a possibility in this world. Romans 5 says that certainly, as we know, we don't need Romans 5 to tell us this, but everyone is subject to death, including our children. Plenty of parents pull out insurance even on their children just for the sake of trying to deal with what it might be like to go through not only the expenses, but the grief of bearing your children. So all I can say is it's certainly a harder, death is always an enemy, it's always bad. But it certainly is harder when you lose a child. I've done plenty of child funerals, and there's a kind of pain in child funerals that are profound. So how do you prepare for that? You don't worry about it because there's nothing you can do to prevent it. And you should know that by not being a helicopter parent either. I often reminded my wife, and if anybody I'm close enough to offend this way, but I would say, there's nothing you can do, right, by keeping your child from, There's nothing in it. You can't keep your child alive in our home, and you can't keep your child alive in the nursery. You can't keep your child alive, wherever it might be on the jungle gym. So I need to trust God in the providence of my child's life without being reckless. I don't want to be stupid about how I allow my kid to play on the freeway, but I do need to be someone who knows that the life of my child is in the hand of the Lord. Either you believe that or you don't. And so I'm going to do my best to care for my kids and protect my kids, but I'm not going to be ridiculous about that as some parents are, because I trust that God is the one who holds the life of my kids in his hands. So I don't want you to worry or be anxious about anything because of Matthew 6, and Jesus said that's not what we should do. So if you find yourself repeatedly going back to thinking about your children's death, you do need to come in and meet with someone and have some biblical counseling, try and get your mind out of that pattern and that rut of thinking. But all you can do is say, when crisis strikes, and who knows what's next for us, right? You could be Johnny Erickson Tata, dive into a pool and be a quadriplegic. We don't know that, but I'm not going to be afraid of that. I'm not going to be cautious about diving, and I'm going to be careful with my children, but I'm not going to be obsessed with kind of putting myself in a plastic bubble, nor am I going to do that for my children. So all I can say is when profound difficulties come, this is where all that I preached in the last 3 weeks from this platform needs to be put into action. You can make it. God can give you the grace to get through the death of your child. He can, and he will. But you've got to lean in to God's means to get that comfort. And that is that you cannot isolate. You need to lean into your church. But don't brood on it, and you can't let your mind be constantly worried about anything, right? Jesus said that. You just can't. And think about what Jesus said in Matthew 6. He knew, right? This is the Son of God. He knew what was coming in 70 AD. It's just a few decades later, the Romans were going to come in and wipe these people out. Largely. Many of them would have to run into the desert for their lives, and many of them were killed. And Rome was going to squash the Israeli people. And Jesus was teaching them, don't worry about tomorrow. Just don't worry about it. And I like that because I recognize probably many of those people there, the young people in particular, were killed by the Romans. And he said, I don't want you worrying about that. And he knew what was coming for them. A sparrow, is when he said this, a sparrow does not fall from a tree apart from your father. And your child's not going to stop breathing apart from your father. And then if you say, how could you? Why, God? You got to think about all the kids that died this year in America or around the world. That this is a part of being in the fallen world. And we care about our family members because of familiarity or because of our connection to them. And I'm not trying to be dispassionate or uncaring. I'm just saying death is bad no matter who it affects. And if you brood about what potentially could happen, I'm just saying you're going to be taken away from what God wants us to focus on. And we have to focus on trusting him for our provision and for the provision of our children. But we'll walk you through it. We've done it. We've done it with people in this room. We've buried their children, and that's a hard thing, but God can get you through it. That was a tough question. Here in the back, and then we'll do Asha next. Let's get this one first.
Hi, I have two things I would like you to comment on. First, when my dad died in Japan, I had an argument with my grandma about where his ashes were going to be kept because he got sick right before he passed away. She wanted to keep them at her Buddhist cemetery, and I wanted to keep them at my church in Osaka.
You want to keep them where? I missed that part.
My church in Osaka.
It's your church?
Church.
Okay. Is there a crypt there or some kind
There is a room where they keep old boxes.
Okay. So you had to debate about where to put the ashes? Okay.
And then I asked my church, and they said that where ashes were kept is not important. And for Christians, where the spirit goes is important. So my church told me that we could just divide the ashes into 2 boxes to make my grandma happy. She would have 1 box at her grave, and I would have the other box at my church. So that's what we did, and my grandma and I were both satisfied.
Both dissatisfied?
Yes, that's one thing. And the second, my preference is to have my remains stay in America for my children. But if I still have my relatives in Japan, it might be good to have my remains at my church in Osaka. For Japanese culture, it's common and important to visit family graves or have kind of memorial ceremony once in a while after family members die. So I was thinking if I die before my mom does, and I have my ashes at church in Osaka, my mom and others would have to visit my church at least once a year, and that would give my relatives a chance to hear the gospel. In that case, I was thinking I would divide my ashes between America and Japan.
Okay.
So please give your comment on those two
My
issues.
comment is I don't want you to be cremated. That's my first comment. And it doesn't matter what the culture says, I would not recommend that you are cremated. Once it happens, like in the case of your family member, I almost thought this was Solomon saying what he said, let's just split the ashes, and that's where I would have said if I were you, no. Put them where you want. Here's the one thing I would do. I'm not for cremation, you know that. It's probably come up in this series, and I can make my case for that. But if there is a cremation, I prefer that it is somewhere entombed somewhere, because I think the biblical process of having a place where they're, like Jezebel when she dies, and part of the curse on that, or at least the appropriate end to her life, is there was no place to mourn her body, right? Because she's being processed through the intestines of the dogs, and that was part of the exclamation point on the judgment on her. There should be a place, I think, if your loved ones have been, cremated, the ashes, it would be best, in my opinion, this is my opinion, my comment, is to keep those ashes together and to put them somewhere. It would be worth paying for a slot in a mausoleum somewhere to say, here is the place, put a placard on it and say, this is the place. If you want to go visit and remember, put it in one place. So that's what I would say. Secondly, where to bury. I like your logic. If your mother is still alive and you die, for the sake of respect for her, and I wouldn't go so far as the tradition of cremation, but I would say to be entombed, or to be interned in Japan, that might make perfect sense. But you're married, and I would defer to your husband in that discussion, because he may say, no, I don't want that, right? We live here, and you're going to be buried here. And you can't defer to your mother because of the principle of leaving and cleaving in the book of Genesis. So you can say to your husband, if I die before my mom dies, let's transport the body, pay for the transportation, and bury me in Japan. And I think that's a reasonable request. But it's also reasonable for your husband to deny that request. And I would read the 10th chapter of my book if you haven't. It may not be persuasive to you, but it's my best argument for the preference of burial over cremation. Asha.
Yeah, I would like to know that, in memorial service, people bring flowers and they spend money and this and that, and it is all done for the family and friends. But I personally would like to have that ceremony when I'm alive and I get to know what my friends think of me.
Mm-hmm.
So no, seriously, I mean, this is not a joke, because I'm always kidding around, but this is a serious question. So if you can suggest something, I cannot call it memorial because I am alive here. Which name would you suggest?
I would suggest that that's what birthdays are for.
No, seriously.
No, I'm serious. I am serious. I hope a birthday celebration is an opportunity for people to say what they think in appreciation of your life. You may get more of that at your memorial service, but that's just part of how life works. When you're gone, that's when people start to recognize, wow, let me take some time to reflect. And I'm just saying, you have opportunities, I think, in special occasions that are centered on you, which I think are appropriate. I don't think it's unbiblical to have a birthday celebration and to ask, hey, I don't know what you'd say about me when I'm gone, but I would love to be encouraged by your thoughts of my life. I don't think that's inappropriate. I wouldn't do it every year, but I would definitely say Birthdays are certainly an opportunity for that. Yeah. Yep, back here. Rick, Mike,
That's right.
hello.
Question, I have a trust on 2 properties, but I think I seen something where they said you had it for your fire insurance, your earthquake insurance and all that. They were saying that your trust has to be on the title as well. Have you found that out to be true, or?
Yes, but I think Rick can say more about it, but I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I would put both properties in a single trust. And you can insure those. There's been some commercials lately that have said, oh, you got to be really careful about this. But I think that's a marketing ploy. Revocable living trusts can hold real estate, and they should hold all of your real estate in one place to make it easier to wrap up your affairs.
I was told that maybe the insurance company may not pay out, especially with all these fires going on.
Yeah.
They may not pay out if the title of the policy is in just mine and my wife's name, and the deeds are in the trust.
So you should check with your insurance company.
Right, and you want to make sure you're not getting that information from another insurance company.
Right, I think it's a marketing ploy, but you should check with them. Check with
Right.
your insurance company and ask them, are you going to cover this because it's titled in my family trust?
We're going to call AAA tomorrow. By the way.
Okay, call AAA.
And the other question was more on a moral scale. So if you remember Terry Scheibel's case?
Yes.
Do you consider that an extraordinary measure, or is that?
Here's what I would suggest. Terry Schiavo's case was very complicated, and there were so many competing issues. And if you don't know much about Terry Schiavo's case, you might want to listen to World Magazine did a podcast. I don't know how many episodes on this podcast just about Terry Schiavo's case. They tried to skate in the middle in terms of expressing their views on Terry Schiavo's, care, but it would be good to listen to just to show how complicated these issues are and all the competing voices. World Magazine put this out. If you just look up Terry Schiavo, I know there's a couple other things out there and maybe even podcasts about it, but the one that done by World Magazine, it's a Christian organization. They're not always super conservative, but they can be. But this particular podcast tracks her story. You guys remember Terry Schiavo, right? That does bring up some of these issues of what I have touched on in this series. But listen to that podcast. I'm not sure what it's called. Probably just Terry Schiavo's case or the life of Terry Schiavo. Anybody heard that podcast? Anybody? Yeah, it's worth a listen. Yeah. Oh, here, yes.
Yeah, Pastor Mike, Robert, I have a question for you. Just want to get your comments on it. We're going to finalize a living trust coming up soon. Good idea to have all 3 adults there, our kids, in front of the attorney that's drawing it up that we've already made clear.
No? I mean, I don't think you need your children there for that. What would be your reason for that, Robert? Why?
Just to get some clarity from the get-go so that we don't have miscommunication that you talked about.
Yeah. Are you splitting up your inheritance between them equally?
Probably so.
Okay. Well, then, yeah, I don't think. You may want to come home from that appointment and have a little family dinner and talk about what you've done and maybe even pass out a copy of it. But I don't think it. I wouldn't bring my kids into the attorney's office. Although, if there are questions, which there may be, you're asking me my opinion. I wouldn't do it. I would have the discussion after I'm done, especially if there's equality in your disposition of your assets. Yes?
So I had an update on the insurance question. You can ask your insurance company to just have an additional insured be your living trust. So if they say, oh, that's a problem, then you can just ask them to add to the policy that the revocable living trust is an additional insured on the policy.
Okay.
Hi, Pastor Mike.
Hi.
My mom passed away about 14 years ago, and she'd already prepaid a cremation, and that's what she told us her whole life she wanted. At the time of her passing, there were issues with my brother and I about what to do. He's a non-believer. He didn't want a service or anything. I did. We had a little service here.
He didn't want a service?
No.
Okay, go
He
ahead.
said she wouldn't want that.
Right.
But he really didn't want that because he didn't want his mortality brought into it. I
Correct.
think, and that he wouldn't be represented well, and I would. So it's just an issue.
Correct.
That led to an issue about her ashes were in a nice urn. I said that I thought we should get a little, what they call those, where you put them in the little wall thing. He said, no, she's coming to my house. She didn't visit me enough, and now she's going to be on my mantle. Because of the big blowout about the service, and I wasn't a good Christian because I wanted it, all that, I just said, okay, if that's what you want. Well, time has passed. She did go on his mantle, but now she's in the spare bedroom. He told me, I think it's time that you have Mom, a couple years ago, and I said, I never wanted that. So my question to you is it important that maybe I should take my mom's ashes and put them somewhere, or I just left it of like, yeah, that's what you wanted, that's what you got.
Yeah.
But I don't want to be disrespectful to my mom.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it to me. I mean, I don't
I
feel
understand.
anything with the ashes.
I'm just going to preface my answer with a statement that I hope when I'm preaching, well, let me go back a step further. And I may have said this to some of you before, but if you ever go to a church where the worship director or the pastor who's starting the service tells you to forget everything about your week and let's just God put it out of our minds and we're just here to think about the Lord, I will never pray that prayer. I want you to bring in thoughts just like that into the service. Because if I talk about you struggling in your life because of your Christianity, here's a good example of it. There's a good example back there. I want you to think about your life when you come to church, because when I'm preaching, this is the kind of conflict that I'm trying to constantly think of. What are our people going through? That's a good example. Your brother, I got some thoughts about this is your brother, right? It is so typical that a non-Christian sibling is trying to argue for no service. I've had this in my extended family. I know how this goes. They don't care about anybody but themselves and their own fear. They're afraid of death. And it's an absolute horrible thing to go through. And I mean, there are worse things. I don't want to use superlative language, but it's a bad thing when you've got that attitude, particularly in an alpha personality that's pushing his weight around to get what he wants. I love your conciliatory. It's okay. I think that's wise. You got to choose your battles wisely. If you can't win on the burial part, okay. And if you can't win on putting her ashes somewhere that can memorialize her life in a particular place so it doesn't move from bedroom to basement or whatever, that would have been better. You argued for all of that. I think intuitively, because the Spirit of God dwells in your life, I think that all that was wise. But now if you're thinking, maybe I'm feeling guilt because I should want some time, well, I would say no. By the time we get to the place of putting ashes in an urn, right, as the debris, frankly, of burning and pulverizing bone fragments, right, I'm thinking, yeah, you want to keep what remains of the burning process? Fine. Try not to tip it over and vacuum it up, right? Because, yeah, your mother, and even I would train you Christians, if I could, to not speak of the deceased, even though the Bible does it a few times. In the narratives of Scripture, my mom, is on his mantle. Your mom's not on the mantle. I know you know that. But even if our language could reflect our theology, right? Your mom's spirit is not on this planet anymore. Her body is not even on this planet in any recognizable way, right? At least most of our loved ones who are buried in a recognizable way, we don't like to picture all this, but at least their bodies have been preserved and they're put in vaults and they've been, many of them embalmed like Joseph was. So there's some resemblance of this body in repose, right? But a burned body. I took the pastors once, I think I said this at the outset, to see the cremation process, which now with the internet, you can see some of it if depending on how you're surfing the internet. But you don't even have really a body to mourn in that sense. So I think a photo album of your mother is a more appropriate thing to pick up and look through to honor your mother's memory than trying to get a hold of that urn and spend time with that urn on your mantle. Yeah, I think everything you've done intuitively, I think is precisely what I would recommend.
Good evening, Pastor Mike.
Hello.
Hi. Two-part question. You can answer one first or the other, whichever you choose. Part A, what percentage of people that you've officiated, however you want to call it, are cremated versus burial? And also, just to change the mood a little bit, in your experience, how would you compare the tenor of a Christian burial to a non-Christian? I remember I was here once a few years ago I was actually performing a ministry service here between non-saved and saved. I remember a few years ago there was a young woman who came here to be buried at her request, and her family was not believers. And I remember that was a kind of a wake-up call.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the percentages, I'm fighting the culture in trying to stand for burial. So, I don't win this battle. It's not an A-level priority one battle. It's a second-tier, tertiary battle. But I would say, thankfully, at least in my influence, maybe 75% are burial, maybe 70, I'm guessing. I'd have to go through and do some statistical work. Plenty of people that I do funerals for are still cremated. So, yeah, I'm not backing out of cremated services. The differences are hard to describe because what I'm concerned about as Ecclesiastes says at a funeral is to preach to the people that are there. Obviously, it doesn't matter. The deceased is not around. I don't think they're listening to anything. God's not allowing that, I'm assuming. So here's how I do a lot of non-Christian funerals today, and that is by having a congregant has a loved one, a father, a brother, whatever, and they're not, or child, like we just had, we're a child, an adult child, whatever, 25 or whatever. The child is not saved, perhaps, many of those. And so I'm preaching to a Christian about a loved one that's lost. Those are really hard, but that tone is very careful. I'm very careful because there's nothing I can do about the status of the person that's lost, but I care about my congregant, and a lot of times they show up with their small group or their ministry friends, and I'm trying to preach to them to bring as much comfort as I can to the loss of a loved one. I may have mentioned this at the outset when I was doing the first installment of this. I used to be on call when I was a small church, the only employee. I would do funerals all the time for non-Christians, but I usually did those in a mortuary chapel. And those I just had to stick to. I didn't know a lot of the people. I would read their biography, I would learn about them, but I would go there and do the best I could to comfort people and proclaim the gospel. That's a little different because I'm like a rent-a-pastor, right? And that's very different. Now I don't do that anymore. Some guys occasionally, our staff guys may go and do that when it's needed, right? We want to serve our community if we can. But usually I'm really caring about the people in front of me. Now, a lot of times I'm preaching to a mixed crowd. I have a lot of non-Christians there. So, we're having to be as wise as we possibly can as to how to deal with that sermon. And in my pastoral ministries class at CBI across the street, I make these guys put together a number of services for different kinds of decedent, right? Is it a child? Is it a non-Christian? Is it a Christian? Is it a person? We don't know their spiritual status, right? We're not sure. So give me different sermon outlines for this funeral so we can think through how you might do that. And do the same thing for weddings with different arrangements. But I do think it's important that a pastor is very deft and flexible to go in a lot of different directions in a funeral. I mean, there are some funerals we do, just did one for Pat Fairchild. Mostly Christians in the room and a wonderful Christian gal. And it's just a great tribute on the one hand, which is always tempered by sobriety because death is terrible and loss is real. But those are different. Those are just, they're not the stress of the other kinds. Funerals are stressful. Weddings are stressful too, but now you're getting into pastor stories, which I don't want to tell, so not right now. All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you go a little bit more detail about embalming, and if you feel that if you're having a memorial and not a funeral, you have to be embalmed? Do you recommend it, and kind of go into that?
A lot of people have funerals and they never open the casket, right? So there's no need to embalm. But embalming usually is something that morticians are going to say, hey, this is important if we're going to have an open casket or a viewing. Not that it has to be. A lot of the viewings take place at the mortuary. There can be refrigeration and all the rest, and there's just a time or a small side room. And I go to plenty of those with, a widower or a widow and maybe a family, and just I'm there for those. So, embalming, like, to quote Joseph again, or to quote Joseph's narrative, is about preservation, at least, trying to consider preservation. You could go, this is gross, but you could go to the mortuary right now and you could exhume a body that has been buried and embalmed, 40 years ago, and that body's going to be in decent shape. It's just part of the psychology in many people's minds to think about the preservation process. Even like in Jesus' day, Nicodemus shows up to wrap his body, right, in spices. Pounds and pounds of spices. Of course, that's practical purpose for the odor of a decomposing body, but all of it is about preservation. And I think biblically, because we believe in the afterlife and the resurrection, that the body's going to be reunited. But if you want to save money and not have your body embalmed, or your parents or whoever that you're dealing with, that's not a problem. But I do prefer, I don't know if this came up in the lectures because I didn't hear them yet, but I prefer doing funerals over memorials. I would like to have the body in the room, even if we don't open the casket. And we don't need to do that if you don't want to. Most people are shy away from it, but embalming is not necessary. But I'm not opposed to it either.
Do you have any suggestions about leaving assets to a minor, in particular from proceeds from a life insurance plan?
Yeah.
The reason I ask is when my wife Marlee's father passed, he left our then minor daughter as a beneficiary on the life insurance policy. That turned out to be a major headache. The insurance company wanted to charge us what it amounted to about half the proceeds. And we got around it by Marlee spending a lot of time in a courtroom.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have any wisdom to impart.
That's one of the advantages of a trust, where you can be very specific about how the disposition goes to minor children. And if you do your trust when your kids are minors, right, you immediately start to figure out, okay, I want to be able to stage the acquisition of these assets to particular benchmarks in their lives. And you can arrange it however you'd like. And I think that's the way you ought to do it. You don't want to give a 17-year-old, $1 million. And I don't want to give an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old $1 million. So what I did in my trust is I gradiated what they would get. And I also directed funds to whoever would care for them, obviously, as a minor child. I had to pick that person and that family and then be able to direct funds to them, but you can arrange it however you'd like. You could say you're not going to get this till you're 35, if you want. Yeah. Yeah, of a license. Well, even, well, I'm not an insurance guy, but I'm sure, well, yeah, we'd have to ask Rick, but can't insurance people? Well, I don't know. That's a question that's out of my wheelhouse, but I have thoughts, but I don't know that they're right. But good question. And you probably know a lot more about it going through the process of that. We need to ask you about that. But
So there are ways to do that. I think in this particular case, it was a grandpa that did it
yes,
and named the minor as the beneficiary. The grandpa's probably not going to name the trust. If you buy insurance for your kids, you should probably name the trust.
correct.
But there are ways around it. Rick Dival just told me one way that you could do that, not around it, but a way that may be a little more simpler than spending a lot of time in court.
Yeah, and couldn't you, in an insurance policy, if I can persuade a grandparent to arrange this differently, Rick, can't I?
Yeah, if you knew the grandparent was going to do that, you would ask them just to do it into the trust.
Right.
And then you would put a provision in the trust that was consistent with what the grandparents' goals and objectives were
Sure.
for that child. But you'd have to know what your grandparents are doing.
Right, and that's true, and that's not, did you know the grandparent was doing this? It was a surprise, yeah. Well, let me speak to the grandparents, obviously. This is not what you want to do. You want to work with your children when you're pulling out insurance policies. Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, I was a missionary overseas, and at that time I told my family, like, if something happens to me, don't bring my body back because of the expense. So, what is your perspective on that for people that are in service overseas? Like with the military, they bring your body back.
Right.
But as a missionary, you may not, your family may.
What was your missions organization? Were you part of a sending organization?
It was a very small organization.
Okay, well, yeah, I would try to make a deal with them, even a provision in my contract that, I want to take an offering to get my body back to my home state. Yeah, and people that work at the airlines, I mean, this is not, it's not astronomical. And depending on where you could be in Papua New Guinea or Irian Jaya or whatever, and still be able to arrange to get the funds raised. I would hope even the churches that contribute to your missions work, the day you die, especially as a young missionary they're supporting, and we would want to take if you were one of our missionaries, we would take up an offering, we would do what we need to do to get your body back. Because I think the body is important, and the scripture provides those principles of a proper burial. I wouldn't want to just leave you in the mission field, although that's not the end of the world. I would rather you be buried on the mission field than to be cremated and have your ashes sent back. Because you can do that in a briefcase. So that would be, yeah, I mean, if it really is a financial hardship. And a lot of people say that to me, well, I get cremated because I can't afford it. I'm like, well, let's work this out to where you can afford it, and we can deal with the delta between the cost of cremation and the cost of a simple burial. I don't want money to be the issue, which is usually an excuse to the same people that are going off to a ski trip in Aspen or whatever. We can figure out the finances. But in your case, obviously, the funds can be limited. But I would try my best. And if I can't do it, fine. I don't think where you're buried is as important as being buried in my hierarchy of principles that I have derived in my study and practice.
Good evening, Pastor Mike.
Hi.
I have two questions. One is, I know some cultures, they light candles to remember the loss.
Huh?
So what is the biblical worldview on that one? In addition, offsprings that were born from the first marriage.
I can't hear this one. Say that second question again. Start it again.
And the other question is offspring that was born from the first marriage and a burial, what is the biblical worldview on that?
Okay, I'm going to need more on that, but let me deal with your first question first, and then we'll come back to that second question. I don't mind the variety of traditions regarding the deceased or ceremonies, as long as we're dealing with the body in a respectful way and burying or putting in it can be, Jesus was put in a tomb cut out of the rock. So if we want to light a candle, as long as we don't add extra biblical meaning to that candle, I don't mind if candles are lit. I don't mind if leis are put around your neck. I don't mind if there's votive candles floating away in balloons. None of that to me matters. I think we can accommodate the customs of the people in a ceremony for the dead, as long as we are not following some sort of cultic tradition. And I don't think lighting a candle, though it's the liturgical churches, it's part of that, but it's not. There's nothing incommensurate with Christianity to follow the culture. I'm not interested in doing a Buddhist funeral or a Hindu funeral, or you see what I'm saying? There are limits to that. So that's my answer about that. If we were on the mission field, for instance, right, and someone dies, as long as I'm not following the dictates of some religious movement and has religious meaning in the minds of the people there, I don't mind what the culture might do, as long as it's not trying to usurp the lordship of Christ. So don't mind, depending on where I am, to the Jews, I'll be like the Jews, the Romans, those without the law. So as long as I'm not violating Scripture. As to your kids, from a previous marriage, right? If you've lost the right to say about their burial, is that what you're asking?
What I'm asking is the parent having the first marriage, and the offsprings are still alive, and there's a remarriage.
Okay, right.
So.
What's your question? What about your children? If they die, or?
No, if the parents.
If you die.
Children, yes.
Okay.
And what is appropriate or the biblical worldview if the parents would be buried with the original?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, it matters, of course, and emotions matter, and relationships matter, and all the rest, but been through this many times, right? In terms of burial plots and all the rest. In my mind, right, let's just figure out whatever makes sense. And that could mean economic sense, it could mean travel sense, it could be the economics of putting a body in across the country or in a different state. So, yeah, make a plan. I would definitely make a plan. Like, where am I going to be? Like, some people, usually when there's a divorce, right, and there might be a double plot, right? Let's just say I have a plot with my wife at the cemetery. I die tomorrow, right? She marries some great guy, and then what's she going to do, right? What's she going to do? And so I'm just saying I don't care, right? I mean, it doesn't matter, and I'm just saying do whatever is emotionally, relationally right. So she can be buried with him or wherever he's going to be buried. I don't know. So it doesn't matter. And I'll be much more understanding when I'm dead. So it doesn't matter. So it's up to the families. And I would sit down and just, figure that out. And we have situations like that. I've had conversations and planning, and we figure out what we can figure out. And do what you can about where you're going to be buried. Just get a plot. And as you've learned in this session of lectures, get it soon. That would be good. Even if it doesn't work out, you can sell the plot. Your family can sell the plot. And just get buried somewhere. And economically, it makes sense to do that arrangement ahead of time. I may have missed the question. If so, we can talk after, or raise your hand again and I can try and hit it better. I want to answer it. I hope I caught the essence of it. Microphones are coming. We can save the pause if you just wave down Rick or Pastor Kellen right now while we're answering this question. Or this could be the last question.
I have a question about my mom and dad. this is before I was a Christian. So my mom and dad went to a church, but regardless of that, I guess my dad cremated my mom.
Okay,
Without telling my sister or me or anything. I didn't know about it.
okay,
And so, so we all drove up. This is in Oregon, and we drove up to the Silverton Hills, and she was buried in a plot, under the ground.
the ashes were,
Yes.
okay,
Yes. And so then when my dad died, this is probably terrible, but when my dad died, he wanted to be cremated, and he had a plot right next to her.
okay,
But then the funeral home was saying, like, how many people are in your family? Do you want some of the ashes? Do you want some of the ashes?
Right.
And, so at that time, I got a little urn, and I gave my sister a little urn, and
Okay.
then he's in just a box. I still have him at my house.
well, he's not there, but you have ashes there,
There are
right?
ashes,
Yeah, it's part of the ashes, right?
And he has this plot up that my sister paid for.
Yeah.
But we've never taken him up there.
Yeah, well, he's not there,
What
but
do
yeah,
I
you've
do
not
with-
taken the ashes there. Yeah, yeah, and for all my advocacy for burial, right, I don't think, much like the first question about, I think it was the first question, yeah, it's like your brother, or I think it was your brother, whatever, it's in your closet or your back room, fine. And in this case, to leave things as they are, that's fine. Especially when I think about the stewardship of saying, if everyone agrees, let's get all this together and go to the plot that he bought and let's bury the ashes, well then great. I do think if you've got cremation, the next best thing is that can we have a plot or a place? And I think that's appropriate, not as part of your furniture, right? So, or your decorations. Packed away, he's packed away, right, his body's packed away. Fine. So yeah, I do think it's a step above, and if it's convenient, or at least it's something that can be done, and it's not ridiculously expensive, and you're up there anyway visiting family, and you go to the cemetery and say, yeah, we want to intern these ashes here, yeah, it'd be great, even if it was just your portion of the ashes. I think it's fine. I wouldn't put it as the top priority for this week, but yeah. Yeah, it's clearly not, but I wouldn't say, based on my answer, let's crank it up to the top priority. It doesn't need to be the top priority, right? Yes.
This coming Wednesday is the Lunar New Year. It's important for certain East Asian and Southeast Asian cultures.
Right.
In my family, the East Asian part of my family, they like to light incense to honor ancestors who have passed
Right.
decades ago and whatnot.
Right.
Family makes a big point of saying that this isn't veneration, this isn't worship, this is honoring and remembering the ancestors. It's what do you think about that? It's uncomfortable, but it doesn't strike me as anyway.
Yeah, no, and that's a great, you're pushing toward the line, but you're not, I mean, this is the fuzzy area that I preach on from Romans 14. And I would say, like, if my wife was like, I get my conscience, don't do that, honey, right? Well, I would say, then I'm not going to do it. But if my conscience is strong enough to say, hey, this is not a religious thing, this is not veneration, whatever, if it's for the sake of being like those not under the law, okay. I'd be very reluctant in anything that might be perceived, and I've got to consider who's there, who's watching. Of course, I think of myself as a pastor, so it's even heightened even more. What if they saw me doing this? So my conscience is going to be very sensitive to things like that. I don't think Mike Fabarez would do that, but if you came back from a trip and did that, and I knew it wasn't, veneration and wasn't, okay. I mean, we're not going to start the process of church discipline on you if you do that. That's all I'm saying. So I think this is a gray area because of the qualifications that you made. I'd want to make sure those qualifications weren't just hearsay of an aunt or a cousin that just wants you to participate. But if they know that this is, I mean, if you could open a book and say, well, this is what it really means. I mean, I'd be careful. There are connections like that are enough to violate conscience in some people and not in others. And where it should be a line that we dare not cross is when there's a clear connection. And I wouldn't want to provoke the Lord to jealousy based on Exodus 34, right? He's a jealous God, and I don't want to, even in the New Testament, Paul says that, right? He says, I don't want to go into those temples because I worship a jealous God, in essence, is what he's saying. So I don't want to be, do I want the rapture to take place the moment I'm lighting that stick? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you're going to say, no, I don't want that, right? I'd rather stand in the corner and be a little ostracized by my cousins because I'm thinking, as a Christian, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I'm not usually good on those excuses. I don't really care about your comfort level in most cases if we're talking about black and white deals, but this, I think, is one of those Romans 14 issues. Yeah. Say it again?
Refrain on this.
Yeah.
It's been a conscience issue for years. The caveat is, it's just something I can find in a book really well, because that would assume that my stepmother's family are really observant in their religion, and they are not.
Okay, well, that
So
helps.
It's
Have you read
their custom.
Naselli's book on conscience? Have you read that little book? It's good, and it started, he co-wrote it because of being missionaries in other cultures, and the conscience is really tested when you're a missionary in cross-cultural missions. And so I would recommend the book. I think it's called Conscience. I don't know what the subtitle is. I think it's Andy Naselli. But it's good to just think about the conscience because the Bible makes such a big case about the conscience, and you want to live with a clean conscience. We're going to talk about that in this next series that starts in verse 12 of 2 Corinthians 1. But that, I think, just analyzing your conscience and thinking and making that decision, just to read like that might even be helpful. Because if you haven't done it for conscience sake, I don't know that I'd start now. Okay. You always have a way of asking the hard questions. Why is that your thing? You always got those.
I got a question.
Those hard questions. All right.
How would you go, I guess, in a conversation with your in-laws or parents about thinking about their death and talking about trust and everything?
Christians or non-Christians?
Split.
You mean in a marriage? You got one?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, that's hard. Let me ask you what the motive would be for starting the conversation.
Oh, I guess just seeing how complicated trusts are, and even sisters involved with in-laws with my wife.
Okay.
So just knowing how things
Okay.
are split.
Well, then that would be my appeal. I would say, hey, let's start with hey. I say, hey. I'd say, I just doing the soundboard for all this stuff on the end of life. It's a lot to it. I just wonder if there's any way, if you haven't made plans, can you make some? I wouldn't even want to, as the younger person, sit there and try and coach them through it. I would just want them to get started and do it. Just because, if you both get killed in a car accident this week, it's all going to come on us, and we need some direction. So it's just good to do some pre-planning. And is there any way, just for the sake of love of your daughter and your son-in-law or whatever, I would encourage you maybe to do that. And I would start with that, and then 3 months later, assuming they're still alive, 3 months later, I'd say, how's that going? And can I help you? Here's a card. I would try to push, because you're right. The complication of it would certainly be better if you're not all dealing with it after they're gone. And I think we're preaching to the choir because they're all here for all of this, but there are a lot of people that aren't, and we all need to be advocates, certainly within our families, as we're looking at older people. Not that always the older people die first, but often that's the pattern. And I would say we want to be advocates to have our elderly relatives using foresight and wisdom. This is just a biblically wise thing to do. Is that satisfactory? No? Go ahead, say more. No, is that it? Yeah, good. I would, please, for our sake, it'd be great if you did some planning. And if you need some help, love to be part of it. And here's a set of videos that might even help from Compass Bible Church.
Pastor Mike,
Yes.
why do you prefer funerals versus memorials?
Why do I prefer them? Well, because of Solomon's words in Ecclesiastes that it's good to go to a house of mourning. And I do think it says, because this is the end of every man and the living take it to heart. There's something about the living taking death to heart when there's a casket in the room. There's just more of what I think was intended by a funeral. And a house of mourning usually was not in a casket. In the ancient world, it was just there was a dead body there. And they would mourn over that, and they would remember. And all this happened a lot faster in the ancient world. But I would just say that that is a more poignant experience. And I know many people get up at funerals and say, well, we don't want to make this a funeral. It's not a time of mourning. We want it to be a celebratory. That's a product of our culture. And our culture doesn't want to stare death in the face just like your brother. We don't want to think of it. They don't even have the funeral. That's an increasing pastoral problem that I didn't have when I started this 38 years ago. I didn't have to tell people you need a funeral. I'm having to say that now more than ever. You should have a funeral. And so I think taking the body out and having a memorial has been the trend again of just moving toward, I don't want to think about this. And we should. It shouldn't be joke telling. It shouldn't be, I don't even like the celebration of life stuff. Are we going to celebrate the life? Of course we are going to honor the deceased. But we're here to think about the end of life. And we're looking back and thanking God for this life. But this is death. And I think that's the whole point of a funeral. And to have the body in the room is helpful in achieving that goal.
Pastor Mike, we'll take the last one right here up front.
We just attended over the last month 2 funerals in a Catholic mass.
Mm-hmm.
One of them had the body.
Yeah.
It was taken down the aisle and part of the ceremony.
Yes.
The other one was the ashes
Uh-huh.
in a container that was taken down the aisle.
Right.
I found both services to be equally meaningful. So my question to you is, would you do something like that as a church for somebody who was cremated?
Well, here's what I've done. I've gone to watch how this all happens, and it's repugnant to me. So I'm not in favor of normalizing cremation. So my answer is no. I'm not saying that for every pastor on staff. They may have a different approach to this. I don't think this is something I should mandate. But I would say, no, I wouldn't bring the ashes down the aisle because I don't want to normalize cremation. That's my theology. That's my conviction. I've written on it. I'm published on it. This is important to me to not try to say these are equal because they're not. And I've watched guys in jumpsuits scrape out body parts, put them in grinders. It's just not what I want to act like is the respectful laying aside of the body. It's not. You can be put in a nice urn. I can understand that. And I can see that, in a sense, isn't that comport with what I've said about putting ashes in a burial plot? I want to do that because it's the next best thing I can do about having a place where we can say, here is this person's remains that have been laid to rest. But I wouldn't make that equivalent. And I get what you're saying, but I personally wouldn't do it. Pastor Kellen might do it. Pastor Lucas might do it. I wouldn't do it. All right. Pastor Kellen's turn.
All right, thank you, Pastor Mike. Okay, well, that is it for our 5 sessions. So again, thank you so much for being a part of these last few weeks. It's been a encouragement to all of us just to think through this and be able to equip our church congregation with it. And we hope that you will continue to share these resources once we build them up, even send people to our website, as I told you about. All the videos will be on there, all 5 of the sessions, and so they will be available to whomever is looking for them. So I do want to remind you about the notebook that I mentioned. So give us a few weeks. We'll be working on that. If you are not registered, if you didn't register originally to be part of the End of Life Planning Series, then please do that, because that is where the next communication will come out in a few weeks, just giving you the details on when the notebook will be available And where it will be available, we will print out a few hundreds of the notebooks so you can pick them up and you have them and you don't have to spend all that ink printing them out. But then the digital version will also be on the website and it will live on there so you can access it at any point in time. So that next communication will come out soon, but thank you so much again for being with us the last few weeks. Let me pray and then we will dismiss this evening. God, thank you for all of these resources that you have put in front of us to allow us to teach our church, to equip our church. And Lord, it is an encouragement to all of us as we stand up here and teach throughout this series, the wisdom that you have given us, the experience that you've given us, just dealing with death and memorials and internments and all of these things that we have had to deal with as pastors. And we just pray that this would be helpful resource, that this would get the process moving for many people that have not thought about end-of-life planning, how important it is to think about these things now and be able to steward what you have blessed us with and what we will leave behind. We be able to steward that in a way that's pleasing to you. So thank you so much for this chance to gather together, even fellowship and learn and be equipped with these resources. We just pray that you would be pleased with all the actions that we take because our heart is to please you in all of it. And so I just pray that you would just continue to give everybody here wisdom and discernment in making these decisions, as we know that there's a lot of nuances that go into each specific situation, but we know you know all of those details, and we pray that you would give great wisdom in that. So thank you so much for all that you continue to do for our church and our church body here at Compass. In Jesus' name, amen.